Chapter 10. Trouble at Windles. 1. Mr. Rufus Bennet stood at the window of the drawing-room of Windles, looking out. From where he stood he could see all those natural and artificial charms which had made the place so desirable to him when he first beheld them. Immediately below, flower-beds, bright with assorted blooms, pressed against the ivied stone wall of the house. Beyond, separated from these by a gravel pathway, a smooth lawn, whose green and silky turf rivalled the lawns of Oxford colleges, stretched to a picturesque shrubbery, not so dense as to withhold altogether from the eye of the observer an occasional silvery glimpse of the lake that lay beyond it. To the left, through noble trees, appeared a white suggestion of old stable-yards, while to the right, bordering on the drive as it swept round to a distant gate, nothing less than a fragment of a ruined castle reared itself against a background of firs. It had been this sensational fragment of old England which had definitely captured Mr. Bennet on his first visit to the place. He could not have believed that the time would ever come when he could gaze on it without any lightening of the spirits. The explanation of his gloom was simple. In addition to looking at the flower-beds, the lawn, the shrubbery, the stable-yard, and the castle, Mr. Bennet was also looking at the 5th heavy shower that had fallen since breakfast. This was the 3rd afternoon of his tenancy. The first day it had rained all the time. The second day it had rained from 8 till 12:15, from 12:30 till 4, and from 5 till 11. And on this, the 3rd day, there had been no intermission longer than 10 minutes. It was a trying summer. Even the writers in the daily papers seemed mildly surprised, and claimed that England had seen finer Julys. Mr. Bennet, who had lived his life in a country of warmth and sunshine, the thing affected in much the same way as the early days of the flood must have affected Noah. A first startled resentment had given place to a despair too militant to be called resignation. And with the despair had come a strong distaste for his fellow human beings, notably and in particular his old friend Mr. Mortimer, who at this moment broke impatiently in on his meditations. "Come along, Bennet, it's your deal. It's no good looking at the rain. Looking at it won't stop it." Mr. Mortimer's nerves also had become a little frayed by the weather. Mr. Bennet returned heavily to the table, where, with Mr. Mortimer as partner, he was playing one more interminable rubber of bridge against Bream and Billie. He was sick of bridge, but there was nothing else to do. Mr. Bennet sat down with a grunt, and started to deal. Halfway through the operation, the sound of rather stertorous breathing began to proceed from beneath the table. Mr. Bennet glanced agitatedly down, and curled his legs round his chair. "I have 14 cards," said Mr. Mortimer. "That's the 3rd time you've misdealt." "I don't care how many cards you've got," said Mr. Bennet, with heat. "That dog of yours is sniffing at my ankles." He looked malignantly at a fine bulldog, which now emerged from its cover, and, sitting down, beamed at the company. He was a sweet-tempered dog, handicapped by the outward appearance of a canine plug ugly. Murder seemed the mildest of the desires that lay behind that rugged countenance. As a matter of fact, what he wanted was cake. His name was Smith, and Mr. Mortimer had bought him just before leaving London, to serve the establishment as a watchdog. "He won't hurt you," said Mr. Mortimer carelessly. "You keep saying that," replied Mr. Bennet pettishly. "How do you know? He's a dangerous beast, and if I had had any notion that you were buying him, I would have had something to say about it." "Whatever you might have said would have made no difference. I am within my legal rights in purchasing a dog. You have a dog. At least Wilhelmina has." "Yes, and Pinky Boodles gets on splendidly with Smith," said Billie. "I've seen them playing together." Mr. Bennet subsided. He was feeling thoroughly misanthropic. He disliked everybody, with perhaps the exception of Billie, for whom a faint paternal fondness still lingered. He disliked Mr. Mortimer. He disliked Bream, and regretted that Billie had become engaged to him, though for years such an engagement had been his dearest desire. He disliked Jane Hubbard, now out walking in the rain with Eustace Hignett. And he disliked Eustace. Eustace, he told himself, he disliked rather more than any of the others. He resented the young man's presence in the house, and he resented the fact that, being in the house, he should go about, pale and haggard, as though he were sickening for something. Mr. Bennet had the most violent objection to associating with people who looked as though they were sickening for something. He got up and went to the window. The rain leaped at the glass like a frolicking puppy. It seemed to want to get inside and play with Mr. Bennet. 2. Mr. Bennet slept late on the following morning. He looked at his watch on the dressing-table when he got up, and found that it was past 10. Taking a second to assure himself that he had really slumbered to this unusual hour, he suddenly became aware of something bright and yellow resting beside the watch, and paused, transfixed, like Robinson Crusoe staring at the footprint in the sand. If he had not been in England, he would have said that it was a patch of sunshine. Mr. Bennet stared at the yellow blob with the wistful mistrust of a traveller in a desert who has been taken in once or twice by mirages. It was not till he had pulled up the blind, and was looking out on a garden full of brightness and warmth and singing birds, that he definitely permitted himself to accept the situation. It was a superb morning. It was as if some giant had uncorked a great bottle full of the distilled scent of grass, trees, flowers, and hay. Mr. Bennet rang the bell joyfully, and presently there entered a grave, thin, intellectual-looking man who looked like a duke, only more respectable. This was Webster, Mr. Bennet's valet. He carried in one hand a small mug of hot water, reverently, as if it were a present of jewellery. "Good morning, sir." "Morning, Webster," said Mr. Bennet. "Rather late, eh?" "It is," replied Webster precisely. "A little late, sir. I would have awakened you at the customary hour, but it was Miss Bennet's opinion that a rest would do you good." Mr. Bennet's sense of well-being deepened. What more could a man want in this world than fine weather and a dutiful daughter? "She did, eh?" "Yes, sir. She desired me to inform you that, having already breakfasted, she proposed to drive Mr. Mortimer and Mr. Bream Mortimer into Southampton in the car. Mr. Mortimer senior wished to buy a Panama hat." "A Panama hat?" exclaimed Mr. Bennet. "A Panama hat, sir." Mr. Bennet's feeling of satisfaction grew still greater. It was a fine day, he had a dutiful daughter, and he was going to see Henry Mortimer in a Panama hat. Providence was spoiling him. The valet withdrew like a duke leaving the royal presence, not actually walking backwards, but giving the impression of doing so, and Mr. Bennet, having decanted the mug of water into the basin, began to shave himself. Having finished shaving, he opened the drawer in the bureau where lay his white flannel trousers. Here at last was a day worthy of them. He drew them out, and as he did so, something gleamed pinkly up at him from a corner of the drawer. His salmon-coloured bathing suit. Mr. Bennet started. He had not contemplated such a thing, but, after all, why not? There was the lake, shining through the trees, a mere 50 yards away. What could be more refreshing? He shed his pyjamas and climbed into the bathing suit. And presently, looking like the sun on a foggy day, he emerged from the house and picked his way with gingerly steps across the smooth surface of the lawn. At this moment, from behind a bush where he had been thriftily burying a yesterday's bone, Smith the bulldog waddled out onto the lawn. He drank in the exhilarating air through an upturned nose, which his recent excavations had rendered somewhat muddy. Then he observed Mr. Bennet, and moved gladly towards him. He did not recognize Mr. Bennet, for he remembered his friends principally by their respective bouquets, so he cantered silently across the turf to take a sniff at him. He was halfway across the lawn when some of the mud which he had inhaled when burying the bone tickled his lungs, and he paused to cough. Mr. Bennet whirled round, and then with a sharp exclamation picked up his pink feet from the velvet turf and began to run. Smith, after a momentary pause of surprise, lumbered after him, wheezing contentedly. This man, he felt, was evidently one of the right sort, a merry playfellow. Mr. Bennet continued to run, but already he had begun to pant and falter. when he perceived looming upon his left the ruins of that ancient castle which had so attracted him on his first visit. On that occasion it had made merely an aesthetic appeal to Mr. Bennet. Now he saw in a flash that its practical merits also were of a sterling order. He swerved sharply, took the base of the edifice in his stride, clutched at a jutting stone, flung his foot at another, and, just as his pursuer arrived and sat panting below, pulled himself on to a ledge, where he sat with his feet hanging well out of reach. The bulldog Smith gazed up at him expectantly. The game was a new one to Smith, but it seemed to have possibilities. He was a dog who was always perfectly willing to try anything once. Mr. Bennet now began to address himself in earnest to the task of calling for assistance. His physical discomfort was acute. Insects, some winged, some without wings, but, through nature's wonderful law of compensation, equipped with a number of extra pairs of legs, had begun to fit out exploring expeditions over his body. They roamed about him as if he were some newly opened recreation ground, strolled in couples down his neck, and made up jolly family parties on his bare feet. And then, first dropping like the gentle dew upon the place beneath, then swishing down in a steady flood, it began to rain again. It was at this point that Mr. Bennet's manly spirit broke, and time ceased to exist for him. Eons later, a voice spoke from below. "Hullo," said the voice. Mr. Bennet looked down. The stalwart form of Jane Hubbard was standing beneath him, gazing up from under a tam-o'-shanter cap. Smith the bulldog gambolled about her shapely feet. "Whatever are you doing up there?" said Jane. "I say, do you know if the car has come back?" "No, it has not." "I've got to go to the doctor's. Poor little Mr. Hignett is ill. Oh, well, I'll have to walk. Come along, Smith." She turned towards the drive, Smith caracoling at her side. Mr. Bennet, though free now to move, remained where he was, transfixed. That sinister word ill held him like a spell. Eustace Hignett was ill. He had thought all along that the fellow was sickening for something, confound him. "What's the matter with him?" bellowed Mr. Bennet after Jane Hubbard's retreating back. "Eh?" queried Jane, stopping. "What's the matter with Hignett?" "I don't know." "Is it infectious?" "I expect so." "Great heavens!" cried Mr. Bennet, and, lowering himself cautiously to the ground, squelched across the dripping grass. In the hall, Webster the valet, dry and dignified, was tapping the barometer with the wrist action of an ambassador knocking on the door of a friendly monarch. "A sharp downpour, sir," he remarked. "Have you been in the house all the time?" demanded Mr. Bennet. "Yes, sir." "Didn't you hear me shouting?" "I did fancy I heard something, sir." "Then why the devil didn't you come to me?" "I supposed it to be the owls, sir, a bird very frequent in this locality. They make a sort of harsh hooting howl, sir. I have sometimes wondered," said Webster, pursuing a not uninteresting train of thought, "whether that might be the reason of the name." Before Mr. Bennet could join him in the region of speculation into which he had penetrated, there was a grinding of brakes on the gravel outside, and the wettest motor car in England drew up at the front door. 3. From Windles to Southampton is a distance of about 20 miles, and the rain had started to fall when the car, an open one lacking even the poor projection of a cape hood, had accomplished half the homeward journey. For the last 10 miles Mr. Mortimer had been nursing a sullen hatred for all created things, and when entering the house he came upon Mr. Bennet hopping about in the hall, endeavouring to detain him and tell him some long and uninteresting story, his venom concentrated itself upon his erstwhile friend. "Oh, get out of the way," he snapped, shaking off the other's hand. "Can't you see I'm wet?" "Wet? Wet?" Mr. Bennet's voice quivered with self-pity. "So am I wet." "Father, dear," said Billie reprovingly, "you really oughtn't to have come into the house after bathing without drying yourself. You'll spoil the carpet." "I have not been bathing. I'm trying to tell you." "Hullo," said Bream, with amiable innocence, coming in at the tail end of the party. "Been having a jolly bathe?" Mr. Bennet danced with silent irritation, and, striking a bare toe against the leg of a chair, seized his left foot and staggered into the arms of Webster, who had been preparing to drift off to the servants' hall. Linked together, the two proceeded across the carpet in a movement which suggested in equal parts the careless vigour of the cake-walk and the grace of the old-fashioned mazurka. "What the devil are you doing, you fool?" cried Mr. Bennet. "Nothing, sir, and I should be glad if you would accept my week's notice," replied Webster calmly. "What's that?" "My notice, sir, to take effect at the expiration of the current week. I cannot acquiesce in being cursed and sworn at." "Oh, go to blazes!" "Very good, sir." Webster withdrew like a plenipotentiary who has been handed his papers on the declaration of war, and Mr. Bennet sprang to intercept Mr. Mortimer, who had slipped by and was making for the stairs. "Mortimer!" "Oh, what is it?" "That infernal dog of yours. I insist on your destroying it." "What's it been doing?" "The savage brute chased me all over the garden and kept me sitting up on that damned castle the whole of the morning." "Father, darling," interposed Billie, pausing on her way up the stairs, "you mustn't get excited. You know it's bad for you. I don't expect poor old Smith meant any harm," she added pacifically as she disappeared in the direction of the landing. "Of course he didn't," snapped Mr. Mortimer. "He's as quiet as a lamb." "I tell you he chased me from one end of the garden to the other. I had to run like a hare." The unfortunate Bream, whose sense of the humorous was simple and childlike, was not proof against the picture thus conjured up. "K-k-k!" giggled Bream helplessly. "K-k-k-k!" Mr. Bennet turned on him. "Oh, it strikes you as funny, does it? Well, let me tell you that if you think you can laugh at me with one hand and marry my daughter with the other, you're wrong. You can consider your engagement at an end." "Oh, I say!" ejaculated Bream, abruptly sobered. "Mortimer!" bawled Mr. Bennet, once more arresting the other as he was about to mount the stairs. "Do you or do you not intend to destroy that dog?" "I do not." "I insist on your doing so. He is a menace." "He is nothing of the kind. On your own showing he didn't even bite you once, and every dog is allowed one bite by law. The case of Wilberforce v. Bayliss covers that point thoroughly." "I don't care about the case of Wilberforce and Bayliss." "You will find that you have to. It is a legal precedent." There is something about a legal precedent which gives pause to the angriest man. Mr. Bennet felt, as every layman feels when arguing with a lawyer, as if he were in the coils of a python. "Say, Mr. Bennet," began Bream at his elbow. "Get out," snarled Mr. Bennet. "Yes, but say—" The green baize door at the end of the hall opened, and Webster appeared. "I beg your pardon, sir," said Webster, "but luncheon will be served within the next few minutes. Possibly you may wish to make some change of costume." "Bring me my lunch on a tray in my room," said Mr. Bennet. "I am going to bed." "Very good, sir." "But say, Mr. Bennet," resumed Bream. "Grrrr," replied his ex-prospective father-in-law, and bounded up the stairs like a portion of the sunset, which had become detached from the main body. 4. Even into the blackest days there generally creeps an occasional ray of sunshine, and there are few crises of human gloom which are not lightened by a bit of luck. It was so with Mr. Bennet in his hour of travail. There were lobsters for lunch, and his passion for lobsters had made him the talk of 3 New York clubs. He was feeling a little happier when Billie came in to see how he was getting on. "Hullo, father. Had a nice lunch?" "Yes," said Mr. Bennet, cheering up a little at the recollection. "There was nothing wrong with the lunch." How little we fallible mortals know! Even as he spoke, a tiny fragment of lobster shell, which had been working its way silently into the tip of his tongue, was settling down under the skin and getting ready to cause him the most acute mental distress which he had ever known. "The lunch," said Mr. Bennet, "was excellent. Lobsters." He licked his lips appreciatively. "And, talking of lobsters," he went on, "I suppose that boy Bream has told you that I have broken off your engagement?" "Yes." "You don't seem very upset," said Mr. Bennet, who was in the mood for a dramatic scene, and felt a little disappointed. "Oh, I've become a fatalist on the subject of my engagements." "I don't understand you." "Well, I mean they never seem to come to anything." Billie gazed wistfully at the counterpane. "Do you know, father, I'm beginning to think that I'm rather impulsive. I wish I didn't do silly things in such a hurry." "I don't see where the hurry comes in as regards that Mortimer boy. You took 10 years to make up your mind." "I was not thinking of Bream. Another man." "Great heavens! Are you still imagining yourself in love with young Hignett?" "Oh, no. I can see now that I was never in love with poor Eustace. I was thinking of a man I got engaged to on the boat." Mr. Bennet sat bolt upright in bed and stared incredulously at his surprising daughter. His head was beginning to swim. "Of course I've misunderstood you," he said. "There's a catch somewhere and I haven't seen it. But for a moment you gave me the impression that you had promised to marry some man on the boat." "I did." "But—" Mr. Bennet was doing sums on his fingers. "Do you mean to tell me," he demanded, having brought out the answer to his satisfaction, "do you mean to tell me that you have been engaged to 3 men in 3 weeks?" "Yes," said Billie in a small voice. "Great Godfrey! "No, only 3." Mr. Bennet sank back onto his pillow with a snort. "The trouble is," continued Billie, "one does things, and doesn't know how one is going to feel about it afterwards. You can do an awful lot of thinking afterwards, father." "I'm doing a lot of thinking now," said Mr. Bennet with austerity. "You oughtn't to be allowed to go around loose." "Well, it doesn't matter. I shall never get engaged again. I shall never love anyone again." "Don't tell me you are still in love with this boatman." Billie nodded miserably. "I didn't realize it till we came down here, but as I sat and watched the rain, it suddenly came over me that I had thrown away my life's happiness. It was as if I had been offered a wonderful jewel and had refused it. I seemed to hear a voice reproaching me and saying, 'You have had your chance. It will never come again.'" "Don't talk nonsense," said Mr. Bennet. Billie stiffened. She had thought she had been talking rather well. Mr. Bennet was silent for a moment. Then he started up with an exclamation. The mention of Eustace Hignett had stirred his memory. "What's young Hignett got wrong with him?" he asked. "Mumps." "Mumps? Good God, not mumps!" Mr. Bennet quailed. "I've never had mumps. One of the most infectious— This is awful! Oh, heavens! Why did I ever come to this lazar house?" cried Mr. Bennet, shaken to his depths. "There isn't the slightest danger, father dear. Don't be silly. If I were you, I should try to get a good sleep. You must be tired after this morning." "Sleep, if only I could," said Mr. Bennet, and did so 5 minutes after the door had closed. He awoke half an hour later with a confused sense that something was wrong. He had been dreaming that he was walking down Fifth Avenue at the head of a military brass band, clad only in a bathing suit. As he sat up in bed, blinking in the dazed fashion of the half-awakened, the band seemed to be playing still. There was undeniably music in the air. The room was full of it. It seemed to be coming up through the floor and rolling about in chunks all round his bed. Mr. Bennet blinked the last fragments of sleep out of his system and became filled with a restless irritability. There was only one instrument in the house which could create this infernal din— the orchestrion in the drawing-room, immediately above which, he recalled, his room was situated. He rang the bell for Webster. "Is Mr. Mortimer playing that damned gas engine in the drawing-room?" "Yes, sir. Tosti's 'Goodbye.' A charming air, sir." "Go and tell him to stop it." "Very good, sir." Mr. Bennet lay in bed and fumed. Presently the valet returned. The music still continued to roll about the room. "I am sorry to have to inform you, sir," said Webster, "that Mr. Mortimer declines to accede to your request." "Oh, he said that, did he?" "That is the gist of his remarks, sir." "Very good. Then give me my dressing-gown." Webster swathed his employer in the garment indicated and returned to the kitchen, where he informed the cook that, in his opinion, the Governor was not a force, and that if he were a betting man, he would put his money in the forthcoming struggle on Consul, the almost human, by which affectionate nickname Mr. Mortimer senior was generally alluded to in the servants' hall. Mr. Bennet meanwhile had reached the drawing-room, and found his former friend lying at full length on a sofa, smoking a cigar, a full dozen feet away from the orchestrion, which continued to thunder out its dirge on the passing of summer. "Will you turn that infernal thing off?" said Mr. Bennet. "No," said Mr. Mortimer. "Now, now, now," said a voice. Jane Hubbard was standing in the doorway with a look of calm reproof on her face. "We can't have this, you know," said Jane Hubbard. "You're disturbing my patient." She strode without hesitation to the instrument, explored its ribs with a firm finger, pushed something, and the orchestrion broke off in the middle of a bar. Then, walking serenely to the door, she passed out and closed it behind her. The baser side of his nature urged Mr. Bennet to triumph over the vanquished. "Now, what about it?" he said ungenerously. "Interfering girl," mumbled Mr. Mortimer, chafing beneath defeat. "I've a good mind to start it again." "I dare you," whooped Mr. Bennet, reverting to the phraseology of his vanished childhood. "Go on, I dare you." "I've a perfect legal right—" "Oh, well," he said, "there are lots of other things I can do." "What do you mean?" exclaimed Mr. Bennet, alarmed. "Never mind," said Mr. Mortimer, taking up a book. Mr. Bennet went back to bed in an uneasy frame of mind. He brooded for half an hour, and, at the expiration of that period, rang for Webster, and requested that Billie should be sent to him. "I want you to go to London," he said, when she appeared. "I must have legal advice. I want you to go and see Sir Mallaby Marlowe. Tell him that Henry Mortimer is annoying me in every possible way, and sheltering himself behind his knowledge of the law so that I can't get at him. Ask Sir Mallaby to come down here, and if he can't come himself, tell him to send someone who can advise me. His son would do if he knows anything about the business." "Oh, I'm sure he does." "Eh? How do you know?" "Well, I mean he looks as if he does," said Billie hastily. "He looks so clever." "I didn't notice it myself. Well, he'll do if Sir Mallaby's too busy to come himself. I want you to go up to-night, so that you can see him first thing to-morrow morning. You can stop the night at the Savoy. I've sent Webster to look out a train." "There's a splendid train in about an hour. I'll take that." "It's giving you a lot of trouble," said Mr. Bennet, with belated consideration. "Oh, no," said Billie. "I'm only too glad to be able to do this for you, father dear." Chapter 11. Mr. Bennet has a bad night. The fragment of a lobster shell which had entered Mr. Bennet's tongue at 20 minutes to 2 in the afternoon was still in occupation at 11:30 that night, when that persecuted gentleman blew out his candle and endeavoured to compose himself for a night's slumber. Its unconscious host had not yet been made aware of its presence. He had a vague feeling that the tip of his tongue felt a little sore, but his mind was too engrossed with the task of keeping a lookout for the preliminary symptoms of mumps to have leisure to bestow much attention on this phenomenon. The discomfort it caused was not sufficient to keep him awake, and presently he turned on his side and began to fill the room with a rhythmical snoring. How pleasant if one could leave him so, the good man taking his rest. Facts, however, are facts, and, having crept softly from Mr. Bennet's side, with the feeling that at last everything is all right with him, we are compelled to return 3 hours later to discover that everything is all wrong. It is so dark in the room that our eyes can at first discern nothing. Then, as we grow accustomed to the blackness, we perceive him sitting bolt upright in bed, staring glassily before him, while with the first finger of his right hand he touches apprehensively the tip of his protruding tongue. At this point Mr. Bennet lights his candle. One of the charms of Windles was the old-world simplicity of its lighting system, and we are enabled to get a better view of him. Mr. Bennet sat in the candlelight with his tongue out, and the first beads of a chilly perspiration bedewing his forehead. It was impossible for a man of his complexion to turn pale, but he had turned as pale as he could. Panic gripped him. A man whose favourite reading was the medical encyclopedias, he needed no doctor to tell him that this was the end. Fate had dealt him a knock-out blow. His number was up, and in a very short while now people would be speaking of him in the past tense, and saying what a pity it all was. A man in Mr. Bennet's position experiences strange emotions, and many of them. In fact, there are scores of writers who, reckless of the cost of white paper, would devote 2 chapters at this point to an analysis of the unfortunate man's reflections, and be glad of the chance. It is sufficient, however, merely to set on record that there was no stint. Whatever are the emotions of a man in such a position, Mr. Bennet had them. He had them all, one after another, some of them twice. He went right through the list from soup to nuts, until finally he reached remorse, and, having reached remorse, he allowed that to monopolize him. In his early days, when he was building up his fortune, Mr. Bennet had frequently done things to his competitors in Wall Street which would not have been tolerated in the purer atmosphere of a lumber camp, and, if he was going to be remorseful about anything, he might well have started by being remorseful about that. But it was on his most immediate past that his wistful mind lingered. He had quarrelled with his lifelong friend Henry Mortimer. He had broken off his daughter's engagement with a deserving young man. He had spoken harsh words to his faithful valet. The more Mr. Bennet examined his conduct, the deeper the iron entered into his soul. Fortunately, none of his acts were irreparable. He could undo them. He could make amends. The small hours of the morning are not perhaps the most suitable time for making amends, but Mr. Bennet was too remorseful to think of that. Do it now had ever been his motto, so he started by ringing the bell for Webster. The same writers who would have screamed with joy at the chance of dilating on Mr. Bennet's emotions would find a congenial task in describing the valet's thought processes when the bell roused him from a refreshing sleep at a few minutes after 3 a.m. However, by the time he entered his employer's room, he was his own calm self again. "Good morning, sir," he remarked equably. "I fear that it will be the matter of a few minutes to prepare your shaving water. I was not aware," said Webster in manly apology for having been found wanting, "that you intended rising so early." "Webster," said Mr. Bennet, "I'm a dying man." "Indeed, sir?" "A dying man," repeated Mr. Bennet. "Very good, sir. Which of your suits would you wish me to lay out?" Mr. Bennet had the feeling that something was going wrong with the scene. "Webster," he said, "this morning we had an unfortunate misunderstanding. I'm sorry." "Pray don't mention it, sir." "I was to blame. Webster, you have been a faithful servant. You have stuck to me, Webster, through thick and thin," said Mr. Bennet, who had half persuaded himself by this time that the other had been in the family for years, instead of having been engaged at a registry office a little less than a month ago. "Through thick and thin," repeated Mr. Bennet. "I have endeavoured to give satisfaction, sir." "I want to reward you, Webster." "Thank you very much, sir." "Take my trousers." Webster raised a deprecating hand. "No, no, sir, thanking you exceedingly. I couldn't really. You will need them, sir, and I assure you I have an ample supply." "Take my trousers," repeated Mr. Bennet, "and feel in the right-hand pocket. There is some money there." "I'm sure I'm very much obliged, sir," said Webster, beginning for the first time to feel that there was a bright side. He embarked upon the treasure hunt. "The sum is 16 pounds 11 shillings and 3 pence, sir." "Keep it." "Thank you very much, sir. Would there be anything further, sir?" "Why, no," said Mr. Bennet, feeling dissatisfied nevertheless. There had been a lack of the deepest kind of emotion in the interview, and his yearning soul resented it. "Why, no." "Good night, sir." "Stop a moment. Which is Mr. Mortimer's room?" "Mr. Mortimer, senior, sir? It is at the further end of this passage, on the left, facing the main staircase. Good night, sir. I am extremely obliged. I will bring you your shaving water when you ring." Mr. Bennet, left alone, mused for a while, then, rising from his bed, put on his dressing-gown, took his candle, and went down the passage. In a less softened mood, the first thing Mr. Bennet would have done on crossing the threshold of the door facing the staircase would have been to notice resentfully that Mr. Mortimer, with his usual astuteness, had collared the best bedroom in the house. The soft carpet gave out no sound as Mr. Bennet approached the wide and luxurious bed. The light of the candle fell on the back of a semi-bald head. Mr. Mortimer was sleeping with his face buried in the pillow. It cannot have been good for him, but that was what he was doing. From the portion of the pillow in which his face was buried, strange gurgles proceeded, like the distant rumble of an approaching train on the underground. "Mortimer," said Mr. Bennet. The train stopped at a station to pick up passengers, and rumbled on again. "Henry," said Mr. Bennet, and nudged his sleeping friend in the small of the back. "Leave it on the mat," mumbled Mr. Mortimer, stirring slightly and uncovering one corner of his mouth. Mr. Bennet began to forget his remorse in a sense of injury. He felt like a man with a good story to tell, who can get nobody to listen to him. He nudged the other again, more vehemently this time. Mr. Mortimer made a noise like a gramophone when the needle slips, moved restlessly for a moment, then sat up, staring at the candle. "Rabbits! Rabbits! Rabbits!" said Mr. Mortimer, and sank back again. He had begun to rumble before he touched the pillow. "What do you mean, rabbits?" said Mr. Bennet sharply. The not unreasonable query fell on deaf ears. Mr. Mortimer was already entering a tunnel. "Much too pink," he murmured, as the pillow engulfed him. What steps Mr. Bennet would have taken at this juncture, one cannot say. Probably he would have given the thing up in despair and retired, for it is weary work forgiving a sleeping man. But, as he bent above his slumbering friend, a drop of warm grease detached itself from the candle, and fell into Mr. Mortimer's exposed ear. The sleeper wakened. "What? What? What?" he exclaimed, bounding up. "Who's that?" "It's me, Rufus," said Mr. Bennet. "Henry, I'm dying." "Drying?" "Dying." Mr. Mortimer yawned cavernously. The mists of sleep were engulfing him again. "8 rabbits sitting on the lawn," he muttered, "but too pink, much too pink." And, as if considering he had borne his full share in the conversation, and that no more could be expected of him, he snuggled down into the pillow again. Mr. Bennet's sense of injury became more acute. For a moment he was strongly tempted to try the restorative effects of candle grease once more, but, just as he was on the point of succumbing, a shooting pain, as if somebody had run a red-hot needle into his tongue, reminded him of his situation. A dying man cannot pass his last hours dropping candle grease into people's ears. After all, it was perhaps a little late, and there would be plenty of time to become reconciled to Mr. Mortimer to-morrow. His task now was to seek out Bream, and bring him the glad news of his renewed engagement. He closed the door quietly and proceeded upstairs. Bream's bedroom, he knew, was the one just off the next landing. He turned the handle quietly and went in. Having done this, he coughed. "Drop that pistol," said the voice of Jane Hubbard immediately, with quiet severity. "I've got you covered." Mr. Bennet had no pistol, but he dropped the candle. It would have been a nice point to say whether he was more perturbed by the discovery that he had got into the wrong room, and that room a lady's, or by the fact that the lady whose wrong room it was had pointed what appeared to me a small cannon at him over the foot of the bed. It was not, as a matter of fact, a cannon, but the elephant gun, which Miss Hubbard carried with her everywhere, a girl's best friend. "My dear young lady!" he gasped. On the 5 occasions during recent years on which men had entered her tent with the object of murdering her, Jane Hubbard had shot without making inquiries. What strange feminine weakness it was that had caused her to utter a challenge on this occasion, she could not have said. Probably it was due to the enervating effects of civilization. She was glad now that she had done so, for, being awake and in full possession of her faculties, she perceived that the intruder, whoever he was, had no evil intentions. "Who is it?" she asked. "I don't know how to apologize." "That's all right. Let's have a light." A match flared in the darkness. Miss Hubbard lit her candle and gazed at Mr. Bennet with quiet curiosity. "Walking in your sleep?" she inquired. "No, no." "Not so loud. You'll wake Mr. Hignett. He's next door. That's why I took this room, in case he was restless in the night." "I want to see Bream Mortimer," said Mr. Bennet. "He's in my old room, 2 doors along the passage. What do you want to see him about?" "I wish to inform him that he may still consider himself engaged to my daughter." "Oh, well, I don't suppose he'll mind being woken up to hear that. But what's the idea?" "It's a long story." "That's all right. Let's make a night of it." "I am a dying man. I awoke an hour ago with a feeling of acute pain." Miss Hubbard listened to the story of his symptoms with interest, but without excitement. "What nonsense!" she said at the conclusion. "I assure you." "I'd like to bet it's nothing serious at all." "My dear young lady," said Mr. Bennet, piqued, "I have devoted a considerable part of my life to medical study." "I know. That's the trouble. People oughtn't to be allowed to read medical books." "Well, we need not discuss it," said Mr. Bennet stiffly. He resented being dragged out of the valley of the shadow of death by the scruff of his neck like this. A dying man has his dignity to think of. "I will leave you now, and go and see young Mortimer." He clung to a hope that Bream Mortimer, at least, would receive him fittingly. "Good night." "But wait a moment." Mr. Bennet left the room, unheeding. He was glad to go. Jane Hubbard irritated him. His expectation of getting more satisfactory results from Bream was fulfilled. It took some time to rouse that young man from a slumber almost as deep as his father's, but, once roused, he showed a gratifying appreciation of the gravity of affairs. Joy at one half of his visitor's news competed with consternation and sympathy at the other half. He thanked Mr. Bennet profusely, showed a fitting concern on learning of his terrible situation, and evinced a practical desire to help by offering him a bottle of liniment which he had found useful for gnat stings. Declining this, though not ungratefully, Mr. Bennet withdrew and made his way down the passage again with something approaching a glow in his heart. The glow lasted till he had almost reached the landing, when it was dissipated by a soft but compelling voice from the doorway of Miss Hubbard's room. "Come here," said Miss Hubbard. She had put on a blue bathrobe, and looked like a pugilist about to enter the ring. "Well," said Mr. Bennet coldly, coming nevertheless. "I'm going to have a look at that tongue of yours," said Jane firmly. "It's my opinion that you're making a lot of fuss over nothing." Mr. Bennet drew himself up as haughtily as a fat man in a dressing-gown can, but the effect was wasted on his companion, who had turned and gone into her room. "Come in here," she said. Tougher men than Mr. Bennet had found it impossible to resist the note of calm command in that voice, but for all that he reproached himself for his weakness in obeying. "Sit down," said Jane Hubbard. She indicated a low stool beside the dressing-table. "Put your tongue out," she said, as Mr. Bennet, still under her strange influence, lowered himself onto the stool. "Further out. That's right. Keep it like that." "Ouch!" exclaimed Mr. Bennet, bounding up. "Don't make such a noise. You'll wake Mr. Hignett. Sit down again." "Sit down." Mr. Bennet sat down. Miss Hubbard extended once more the hand holding the needle which had caused his outcry. He winced away from it desperately. "Baby," said Miss Hubbard reprovingly, Why, I once sewed 18 stitches in a native bearer's head, and he didn't make half the fuss you're making. Now keep quite still." Mr. Bennet did, for perhaps the space of 2 seconds. Then he leaped from his seat once more. It was a tribute to the forceful personality of the fair surgeon, if one were needed, that the squeal he uttered was a subdued one. He was just about to speak, he had framed the opening words of a strong protest, when suddenly he became aware of something in his mouth, something small and hard. He removed it and examined it as it lay on his finger. It was a minute fragment of lobster shell. And at the same time he became conscious of a marked improvement in the state of his tongue. The swelling had gone. "I told you so," said Jane Hubbard placidly. "What is it?" It appears to be a piece of—" "Lobster shell. And we had lobster for lunch. Good night." Halfway down the stairs, it suddenly occurred to Mr. Bennet that he wanted to sing. He wanted to sing very loud, and for quite some time. He restrained the impulse and went to bed, but relief such as his was too strong to keep bottled up. He wanted to tell someone all about it. He needed a confidant. Webster, the valet, awakened once again by the ringing of his bell, sighed resignedly, and made his way downstairs. "Did you ring, sir?" "Webster," cried Mr. Bennet, "it's all right. I'm not dying after all. I'm not dying after all, Webster." "Very good, sir," said Webster. "Will there be anything further?" Chapter 12. The Lurid Past of John Peters. "That's right," said Sir Mallaby Marlowe. "Work while you're young, Sam, work while you're young." He regarded his son's bent head with affectionate approval. "What's the book today?" "Widgery on Nisi Prius Evidence," said Sam, without looking up. "Capital," said Sir Mallaby. "Highly improving, and as interesting as a novel. Some novels. There's a splendid bit on, I think, page 254, where the hero finds out all about copyhold and customary estates. It's a wonderfully powerful situation. It appears... but I won't spoil it for you. Mind you don't skip to see how it all comes out in the end." Sir Mallaby suspended conversation while he addressed an imaginary ball with the mashie which he had taken out of his golf bag. For this was the day when he went down to Walton Heath for his weekly foursome with 3 old friends. His tubby form was clad in tweed of a violent nature, with knickerbockers and stockings. "Sam!" "Well?" "Sam, a man at the club showed me a new grip the other day. Instead of overlapping the little finger of the right hand... Oh, by the way, Sam." "Yes?" "I should lock up the office today if I were you, or anxious clients will be coming in and asking for advice, and you'll find yourself in difficulties. I shall be gone, and Peters is away on his holiday. You'd better lock the outer door." "All right," said Sam absently. He was finding Widgery stiff reading. He had just got to the bit about raptu haeredis, which, as of course you know, is a writ for taking away an heir holding in socage. Sir Mallaby looked at his watch. "Well, I'll have to be going. See you later, Sam." "Goodbye." Sir Mallaby went out, and Sam, placing both elbows on the desk and twining his fingers in his hair, returned with a frown of consternation to his grappling with Widgery. For perhaps 10 minutes the struggle was an even one, then gradually Widgery got the upper hand. Sam's mind, numbed by constant batterings against the stony ramparts of legal phraseology, weakened, faltered, and dropped away, and a moment later his thoughts, as so often happened when he was alone, darted off and began to circle round the image of Billie Bennet. Since they had last met, at Sir Mallaby's dinner-table, Sam had told himself perhaps 100 times that he cared nothing about Billie, that she had gone out of his life and was dead to him. But unfortunately he did not believe it. A man takes a deal of convincing on a point like this, and Sam had never succeeded in convincing himself for more than 2 minutes at a time. It was useless to pretend that he did not still love Billie more than ever, because he knew he did, And now, as the truth swept over him for the 101st time, he groaned hollowly, and gave himself up to the grey despair which is the almost inseparable companion of young men in his position. So engrossed was he in his meditation that he did not hear the light footstep in the outer office, and it was only when it was followed by a tap on the door of the inner office that he awoke with a start to the fact that clients were in his midst. He wished that he had taken his father's advice and locked up the office. Probably this was some frightful bore who wanted to make his infernal will or something, and Sam had neither the ability nor the inclination to assist him. Was it too late to escape? Perhaps if he did not answer the knock, the blighter might think there was nobody at home. But suppose he opened the door and peeped in? A spasm of Napoleonic strategy seized Sam. He dropped silently to the floor and concealed himself under the desk. Napoleon was always doing that sort of thing. There was another tap. Then, as he had anticipated, the door opened. Sam, crouched like a hare in its form, held his breath. It seemed to him that he was going to bring this delicate operation off with success. He felt he had acted just as Napoleon would have done in a similar crisis. And so, no doubt, he had, to a certain extent, only Napoleon would have seen to it that his boots and about 18 inches of trousered legs were not sticking out, plainly visible to all who entered. "Good morning," said a voice. Sam thrilled from the top of his head to the soles of his feet. It was the voice which had been ringing in his ears through all his waking hours. "Are you busy, Mr. Marlowe?" asked Billie, addressing the boots. Sam wriggled out from under the desk like a disconcerted tortoise. "Dropped my pen," he mumbled, as he rose to the surface. He pulled himself together with an effort that was like a physical exercise. He stared at Billie dumbly. Then, recovering speech, he invited her to sit down, and seated himself at the desk. "Dropped my pen," he gurgled again. "Yes?" said Billie. "Fountain pen," babbled Sam, "with a broad nib." "Yes?" "A broad gold nib," went on Sam, with the painful exactitude which comes only from embarrassment or the early stages of intoxication. "Really?" said Billie, and Sam blinked and told himself resolutely that this would not do. He was not appearing to advantage. It suddenly occurred to him that his hair was standing on end as the result of his struggle with Widgery. He smoothed it down hastily and felt a trifle more composed. The old fighting spirit of the Marlowes now began to assert itself to some extent. He must make an effort to appear as little of a fool as possible in this girl's eyes. And what eyes they were! Golly, like stars, like two bright planets in... However, that was neither here nor there. He pulled down his waistcoat and became cold and businesslike, the dry young lawyer. "How do you do, Miss Bennet?" he said, with a question in his voice, raising his eyebrows in a professional way. He modelled this performance on that of lawyers he had seen on the stage, and wished he had some snuff to take, or something to tap against his front teeth. "Miss Bennet, I believe?" The effect of the question upon Billie was disastrous. She had come to this office with beating heart, prepared to end all misunderstandings, to sob on her soul-mate's shoulder, and generally make everything up. But at this inane exhibition the fighting spirit of the Bennets, which was fully as militant as that of the Marlowes, became roused. She told herself that she had been mistaken in supposing that she still loved this man. She was a proud girl, and refused to admit herself capable of loving any man who looked at her as if she was something that the cat had brought in. She drew herself up stiffly. "Yes," she replied. "How clever of you to remember me." "I have a good memory." "How nice. So have I." There was a pause, during which Billie allowed her gaze to travel casually about the room. Sam occupied the intermission by staring furtively at her profile. He was by now in a thoroughly overwrought condition, and the thumping of his heart sounded to him as if workmen were mending the street outside. How beautiful she looked, with that red hair peeping out beneath her hat, and... However... "Is there anything I can do for you?" he asked, in the sort of voice Widgery might have used. Sam always pictured Widgery as a small man with bushy eyebrows, a thin face, and a voice like a rusty file. "Well, I really wanted to see Sir Mallaby." "My father has been called away on important business to Walton Heath. Cannot I act as his substitute?" "Do you know anything about the law?" "Do I know anything about the law?" echoed Sam, amazed. "Do I know? Why, I was reading my Widgery on Nisi Prius Evidence when you came in." "Oh, were you?" said Billie, interested. "Do you always read on the floor?" "I told you I dropped my pen," said Sam coldly. "And of course you couldn't read without that. Well, as a matter of fact, this has nothing to do with what you said." "I have not specialized exclusively on Nisi Prius Evidence. I know the law in all its branches." "Then what would you do if a man insisted on playing the orchestrion when you wanted to get to sleep?" "The orchestrion?" "Yes." "The orchestrion, eh? Ah, said Sam. "You still haven't made it quite clear," said Billie. "I was thinking." "Oh, if you want to think." "Tell me the facts," said Sam. "Well, Mr. Mortimer and my father have taken a house together in the country." "I knew that." "What a memory you have," said Billie kindly. "Well, for some reason or other they have quarrelled, and now Mr. Mortimer is doing everything he can to make father uncomfortable. Yesterday afternoon father wanted to sleep, and Mr. Mortimer started this orchestrion just to annoy him." I'm not quite sure. I think that's a tort," said Sam. "A what?" "Either a tort or a malfeasance." "Why, you do know something about it after all," cried Billie, startled into a sort of friendliness in spite of herself. And at the words and the sight of her quick smile, Sam's professional composure reeled on its foundations. He had half risen, with the purpose of springing up and babbling of the passion that consumed him, when the chill reflection came to him that this girl had once said that she considered him ridiculous. If he let himself go, would she not continue to think him ridiculous? He sagged back into his seat, and at that moment there came another tap on the door, which, opening, revealed the sinister face of the holiday-making Peters. "Good morning, Mr. Samuel," said John Peters. "Good morning, Miss Milliken. Oh!" He vanished as abruptly as he had appeared. He perceived that what he had taken at first glance for the stenographer was a client, and that the junior partner was engaged on a business conference. He left behind him a momentary silence. "What a horrible-looking man!" said Billie, breaking it with a little gasp. John Peters often affected the opposite sex like that at first sight. "I beg your pardon," said Sam absently. "What a dreadful-looking man! He quite frightened me." For some moments Sam sat without speaking. If this had not been one of his Napoleonic mornings, no doubt the sudden arrival of his old friend Mr. Peters, whom he had imagined at his home in Putney, packing for his trip to America, would have suggested nothing to him. As it was, it suggested a great deal. He had had a brain-wave, and for fully a minute he sat tingling under its impact. He was not a young man who often had brain-waves, and when they came, they made him rather dizzy. "Who is he?" asked Billie. "He seemed to know you?" "And who," she demanded after a slight pause, "is Miss Milliken?" Sam drew a deep breath. "It's rather a sad story," he said. "His name is John Peters. He used to be clerk here." "But he isn't any longer?" "No," Sam shook his head. "We had to get rid of him." "I don't wonder. A man looking like that." "It wasn't that so much," said Sam. "The thing that annoyed father was that he tried to shoot Miss Milliken." Billie uttered a cry of horror. "He tried to shoot Miss Milliken?" "He did shoot her, the third time," said Sam, warming to his work. "But only in the arm, fortunately," he added. "But my father is rather a stern disciplinarian, and he had to go. I mean, we couldn't keep him after that." "Good gracious!" "She used to be my father's stenographer, and she was thrown a good deal with Peters. It was quite natural that he should fall in love with her. She was a beautiful girl, with rather your own shade of hair. Peters is a man of volcanic passions, and when, after she had given him to understand that his love was returned, she informed him one day that she was engaged to a fellow at Ealing West, he went right off his onion. I mean, he became completely distraught. I must say that he concealed it very effectively at first. We had no inkling of his condition till he came in with the pistol. And after that, well, as I say, we had to dismiss him. A great pity, for he was a good clerk. Still, it wouldn't do. It wasn't only that he tried to shoot Miss Milliken. The thing became an obsession with him, and we found that he had a fixed idea that every red-haired woman who came into the office was the girl who had deceived him. You can see how awkward that made it. Red hair is so fashionable nowadays. "My hair is red," whispered Billie pallidly. "Yes, I noticed it myself. I told you it was much the same shade as Miss Milliken's. It's rather fortunate that I happened to be here with you when he came." "But he may be lurking out there still." "I expect he is," said Sam carelessly. "Yes, I suppose he is. Would you like me to go and send him away? All right." But is it safe?" Sam uttered a light laugh. "I don't mind taking a risk or two for your sake," he said, and sauntered from the room, closing the door behind him. Billie followed him with worshipping eyes. John Peters rose politely from the chair in which he had seated himself for the more comfortable perusal of the copy of Home Whispers which he had brought with him to refresh his mind in the event of the firm being too busy to see him immediately. He was particularly interested in the series of Chats with Young Mothers. "Hello, Peters," said Sam. "Want anything?" "Very sorry to have disturbed you, Mr. Samuel. I just looked in to say good-bye. I sail on Saturday, and my time will be pretty fully taken up all the week. I have to go down to the country to get some final instructions from the client whose important papers I am taking over. I'm sorry to have missed your father, Mr. Samuel." "Yes, this is his golf day. I'll tell him you looked in." "Is there anything I can do before I go?" "Do? Well," John Peters coughed tactfully. "I see that you are engaged with a client, Mr. Samuel, and I was wondering if any little point of law had arisen with which you did not feel yourself quite capable of coping, in which case I might perhaps be of assistance." "Oh, that lady," said Sam. "That was Miss Milliken's sister." "Indeed? I didn't know Miss Milliken had a sister." "No," said Sam. "She is not very like her in appearance." "No, this one is the beauty of the family, I believe. A very bright, intelligent girl. I was telling her about your revolver just before you came in, and she was most interested. It's a pity you haven't got it with you now to show to her." "Oh, but I have it. I have, Mr. Samuel," said Peters, opening a small handbag and taking out a hymn book, half a pound of mixed chocolates, a tongue sandwich, and the pistol, in the order named. "I was on my way to the Rupert Street range for a little practice. I should be glad to show it to her." "Well, wait here a minute or two," said Sam. "I'll have finished talking business in a moment." He returned to the inner office. "Well?" cried Billie. "Eh? Oh, he's gone," said Sam. "I persuaded him to go away. He was a little excited, poor fellow. And now let us return to what we were talking about. You say—" He broke off with an exclamation and glanced at his watch. "Good heavens, I had no idea of the time. I promised to run up and see a man in one of the offices in the next court. He wants to consult me on some difficulty which has arisen with one of his clients. Rightly or wrongly, he values my advice. Can you spare me for a short while? I shan't be more than 10 minutes." "Certainly." "Here is something you may care to look at while I'm gone. I don't know if you've read it. Widgery on Nisi Prius Evidence. Most interesting." He went out. John Peters looked up from his Home Whispers. "You can go in now," said Sam. "Certainly, Mr. Samuel, certainly." Sam took up the copy of Home Whispers and sat down with his feet on the desk. He turned to the serial story and began to read the synopsis. In the inner room, Billie, who had rejected the mental refreshment offered by Widgery, and was engaged on making a tour of the office, looking at the portraits of whiskered men whom she took correctly to be the Thorpes, Prescotts, Winslows, and Applebys mentioned on the contents bill outside, was surprised to hear the door open at her back. She had not expected Sam to return so instantaneously. Nor had he done so. It was not Sam who entered. It was a man of repellent aspect whom she recognized instantly, for John Peters was one of those men who, once seen, are not easily forgotten. He was smiling a cruel, cunning smile. At least, she thought he was. Mr. Peters himself was under the impression that his face was wreathed in a benevolent simper, and in his hand he bore the largest pistol ever seen outside a motion picture studio. "How do you do, Miss Milliken?" he said. Chapter 13. Shocks All Round. Billie had been standing near the wall, inspecting a portrait of the late Mr. Josiah Appleby, of which the kindest thing one can say is that one hopes it did not do him justice. She now shrank back against this wall, as if she were trying to get through it. The edge of the portrait's frame tilted her hat out of the straight, but in this supreme moment she did not even notice it. How do you do?" she said. If she had not been an exceedingly pretty girl, one would have said that she spoke squeakily. The fighting spirit of the Bennets, though it was considerable fighting spirit, had not risen to this emergency. It had ebbed out of her, leaving in its place a cold panic. She had seen this sort of thing in the movies. There was one series of pictures, The Dangers of Diana, where something of the kind had happened to the heroine in every reel, but she had not anticipated that it would ever happen to her, and consequently she had not thought out any plan for coping with such a situation. A grave error. In this world one should be prepared for everything, or where is one? "I've brought the revolver," said Mr. Peters. So I see," said Billie. Mr. Peters nursed the weapon affectionately in his hand. He was rather a shy man with women as a rule, but what Sam had told him about her being interested in his revolver had made his heart warm to this girl. "I was just on my way to have a little practice at the range," he said. "Then I thought I might as well look in here." I suppose you're a good shot?" quavered Billie. "I seldom miss," said John Peters. Billie shuddered. Then, reflecting that the longer she engaged this maniac in conversation, the more hope there was of Sam coming back in time to save her, she essayed further small talk. It's very ugly." "Oh, no," said Mr. Peters, hurt. Billie perceived that she had said the wrong thing. "Very deadly-looking, I meant," she corrected herself hastily. "It may have deadly work to do, Miss Milliken," said Mr. Peters. Conversation languished again. Billie had no further remarks to make of immediate interest, and Mr. Peters was struggling with a return of the deplorable shyness which so handicapped him in his dealings with the other sex. After a few moments he pulled himself together again, and, as his first act was to replace the pistol in the pocket of his coat, Billie became conscious of a faint stirring of relief. "The great thing," said John Peters, "is to learn to draw quickly, like this," he added, producing the revolver with something of the smoothness and rapidity with which Billie, in happier moments, had seen Bream Mortimer take a bowl of goldfish out of a tall hat. "Everything depends on getting the first shot. The first shot, Miss Milliken, is vital." Suddenly Billie had an inspiration. It was hopeless, she knew, to try to convince this poor demented creature, obsessed with his idée fixe, that she was not Miss Milliken. Denial would be a waste of time, and might even infuriate him into precipitating the tragedy. It was imperative that she should humour him, and, while she was humouring him, it suddenly occurred to her, why not do it thoroughly? "Mr. Peters," she cried, "you are quite mistaken." "I beg your pardon," said John Peters, with not a little asperity. "Nothing of the kind." "You are." "I assure you I am not. Quickness in the draw is essential." "You have been misinformed." "Well, I had it direct from the man at the Rupert Street range," said Mr. Peters stiffly. "And if you have ever seen a picture called Two-Gun Thomas—" "Mr. Peters," cried Billie desperately. He was making her head swim with his meaningless ravings. "Mr. Peters, hear me. I am not married to a man at Ealing West." Mr. Peters betrayed no excitement at the information. This girl seemed for some reason to consider her situation an extraordinary one, but many women, he was aware, were in a similar position. In fact, he could not at the moment think of any of his feminine acquaintances who were married to men at Ealing West. "Indeed?" he said politely. "Won't you believe me?" exclaimed Billie wildly. "Why, certainly, certainly," said John Peters. "Thank God," said Billie. "I'm not even engaged. It's all been a terrible mistake." When two people in a small room are speaking on two distinct and different subjects, and neither knows what on earth the other is driving at, there is bound to be a certain amount of mental confusion. But at this point John Peters, though still not wholly equal to the intellectual pressure of the conversation, began to see a faint shimmer of light behind the clouds. In a nebulous kind of way he began to understand that the girl had come to consult the firm about a breach of promise action. Some unknown man at Ealing West had been trifling with her heart. Hardened lawyer's clerk as he was, that poignant cry, "I'm not even engaged," had touched Mr. Peters, and she wished to start proceedings. Mr. Peters felt almost in his depth again. He put the revolver in his pocket and drew out a notebook. "I should be glad to hear the facts," he said with professional courtesy. "In the absence of the governor." "I have told you the facts." "This man at Ealing West," said Mr. Peters, moistening the point of his pencil. "He wrote you letters proposing marriage?" "No, no, no." "At any rate," said Mr. Peters, disappointed but hopeful, "he made love to you before witnesses?" "Never, never! There is no man at Ealing West. There never was a man at Ealing West." It was at this point that John Peters began for the first time to entertain serious doubts of the girl's mental balance. The most elementary acquaintance with the latest census told him that there were any number of men at Ealing West. The place was full of them. Would a sane woman have made an assertion to the contrary? He thought not, and he was glad that he had the revolver with him. She had done nothing as yet actively violent, but it was nice to feel prepared. He took it out and laid it nonchalantly in his lap. The sight of the weapon acted on Billie electrically. She flung out her hands in a gesture of passionate appeal and played her last card. "I love you!" she cried. She wished she could have remembered his first name. It would have rounded off the sentence neatly. In such a moment she could hardly call him Mr. Peters. "You are the only man I love." "My gracious goodness!" ejaculated Mr. Peters, and nearly fell over backwards. To a naturally shy man, this sudden and wholly unexpected declaration was disconcerting, and the clerk was, moreover, engaged. He blushed violently. And yet, even in that moment of consternation, he could not check a certain thrill. No man thinks he is as plain as he really is, but John Peters had always come fairly near to a correct estimate of his charms, and it had always seemed to him that, in inducing his fiancée to accept him, he had gone some. He now began to wonder if he were not really rather a devil of a chap after all. There must be precious few men going about capable of inspiring devotion like this on the strength of about 6½ minutes' casual conversation. Calmer thoughts succeeded this little flicker of complacency. The girl was mad. That was the fact of the matter. He got up and began to edge towards the door. Mr. Samuel would be returning shortly, and he ought to be warned. "So that's all right, isn't it?" said Billie. "Oh, quite, quite," said Mr. Peters. Thank you very much." "I thought you would be pleased," said Billie, relieved but puzzled. For a man of volcanic passions, as Sam Marlowe had described him, he seemed to be taking the thing very calmly. She had anticipated a strenuous scene. "Oh, it's a great compliment," Mr. Peters assured her. At this point Sam came in, interrupting the conversation at a moment when it had reached a somewhat difficult stage. He had finished the installment of the serial story in Home Whispers, and looking at his watch he fancied that he had allowed sufficient time to elapse for events to have matured along the lines which his imagination had indicated. The atmosphere of the room seemed to him, as he entered, a little strained. Billie looked pale and agitated. Mr. Peters looked rather agitated too. Sam caught Billie's eye. It had an unspoken appeal in it. He gave an imperceptible nod, a reassuring nod, the nod of a man who understood all and was prepared to handle the situation. "Come, Peters," he said in a deep, firm, quiet voice, laying a hand on the clerk's arm. "It's time that you went." "Yes, indeed, Mr. Samuel. Yes, yes, indeed." "I'll see you out," said Sam soothingly, and led him through the outer office and on to the landing outside. "Well, good luck, Peters," he said as they stood at the head of the stairs. "I hope you have a pleasant trip. Why, what's the matter? You seem upset." "That girl, Mr. Samuel, I really think, really, she cannot be quite right in her head." "Nonsense, nonsense," said Sam firmly. "She's all right. Well, good-bye." "Good-bye, Mr. Samuel." "When did you say you were sailing?" "Next Saturday, Mr. Samuel. But I fear I shall have no opportunity of seeing you again before then. I have packing to do, and I have to see this gentleman down in the country." "All right. Then we'll say good-bye now. Good-bye, Peters. Mind you have a good time in America. I'll tell my father you called." Sam watched him out of sight down the stairs, then turned and made his way back to the inner office. Billie was sitting limply on the chair which John Peters had occupied. She sprang to her feet. "Has he really gone?" "Yes, he's gone this time." Was he violent?" "A little," said Sam, "a little. But I calmed him down." He looked at her gravely. "Thank God I was in time." "Oh, you are the bravest man in the world!" cried Billie, and, burying her face in her hands, burst into tears. "There, there," said Sam. "There, there. Come, come. It's all right now. There, there, there." He knelt down beside her. He slipped one arm round her waist. He patted her hands. "There, there, there," he said. I have tried to draw Samuel Marlowe so that he will live on the printed page. I have endeavoured to delineate his character so that it will be as an open book. And if I have succeeded in my task, the reader will by now have become aware that he was a young man with the gall of an army mule. His conscience, if he had ever had one, had become atrophied through long disuse. He had given this sensitive girl the worst fright she had had since a mouse had got into her bedroom at school. He had caused John Peters to totter off to the Rupert Street range, making low, bleating noises. And did he care? No. All he cared about was the fact that he had erased for ever from Billie's mind that undignified picture of himself as he had appeared on the boat, and substituted another which showed him brave, resourceful, gallant. All he cared about was the fact that Billie, so cold 10 minutes before, had just allowed him to kiss her for the 42nd time. If you had asked him, he would have said that he had acted for the best, and that out of evil cometh good, or some sickening thing like that. That was the sort of man Samuel Marlowe was. His face was very close to Billie's, who had cheered up wonderfully by this time, and he was whispering his degraded words of endearment into her ear, when there was a sort of explosion in the doorway. "Great Godfrey!" exclaimed Mr. Rufus Bennet, gazing on the scene from this point of vantage, and mopping with a large handkerchief a scarlet face which, as the result of climbing 3 flights of stairs, had become slightly soluble. "Great heavens above! Number 4!